Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Tim Lynch. I'm the convener of the 10 Great Marxist class, Masterclass. And I'm delighted that we've been able to repurpose the series through Zoom. We're all looking forward to seeing you again face to face, we hope very soon. But in the interim, we're delighted to be able to offer a continuation of the series through these means. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am filming this evening, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm zooming from Ivanhoe. I've left Clunes, come back to the hustle and bustle, certainly compared to Clunes, of Melbourne. You're all very welcome. The session will run no longer than an hour, so we'll plan to wrap up by 7:30. I've got a number of questions raised by Karen's terrific masterclass on this evening's book, but what we're really keen to do is to get your questions and your feedback on this very interesting text. So I will defer as much as possible to you guys out there. I won't offer the same introduction, but remind you that Karen Farquharson is the head of the School of Social and Political Sciences and a professor of sociology here at the University of Melbourne. And her research focuses on sociology, particularly of race and of racism, ethnicity and diversity, particularly in the contexts of media and sport, and school sport particularly. Let me start, as we often do, by welcoming Karen, but asking her to perhaps restate why this book is great, a restatement of the book's greatness. Karen, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And I just acknowledge that today is the sorry day, and I'm talking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Sorry Day is a day we recognize the stolen generations and try and do better. And just wanted to acknowledge that while we're here today. Why is this a great book? I think it's a great book because it's a book of its time, and it's had actually a lot of traction. It's still relevant today, and it's still available. It's still published, and it's an interesting exposition of decolonization and the post-colonial struggle of colonized nations. A lot of the theorizing in the book, the conversation in the book, is still conversation that we can apply all around the world in many, many post-colonial contexts today. So I think it's clearly a great book. Still getting assigned at universities. 60 years later, it's quite remarkable, really, especially given, its source, a young man from Martinique writing from Tunisia about Algeria, and yet here we are still reading it. It's amazing.
Thank you. There's a question from Gavin, which I'll read out. A major part of the colonial violence was the decimation of indigenous language. The French on the west coast of Africa, the Spanish in South America, the Portuguese there as well in Angola and Mozambique, and the English almost everywhere else, including Wales. Fanon calls on the creation of post-colonial culture to be other than European and is silent on the matter of language. Why might that be, Karen?
I think that's an interesting question. And obviously I can't get into Fanon's brain. I guess one of the interesting things about Fanon is that he died right when he wrote the book, and so we actually can't ask him these questions, so we just have to surmise why that might be. I think one of the things he would argue, and this is based on my reading of the book, is that colonization killed off many local cultures, and the way to move beyond the colonized relation, because it's a relation of power between a colonizing nation and a colonized nation, or colonized peoples, was to have the colonized peoples come together and find what they have in common with each other. And so what he's sort of arguing against is actually not highlighting the different tribal languages, because in Africa there's plenty of local languages spoken still today. I did my PhD on South Africa, and when I was there in the mid-1990s, they were becoming a new nation, and they had 11 official languages. You know, local languages are alive and well in Africa, but I think he didn't talk about that because he was trying to think about how people could come together rather than how they could be apart, and what they had in common rather than what they had differently. And obviously the colonizers tried to separate the local people into different groups so that they couldn't come together and rise up. And so I think he's put that aside actually purposely with this kind of what I'm calling a Pan-Africanism. I don't think he would call it that, but Pan-Africanism approach to decolonization.
Thank you. Andrew Stevenson, would you like to ask a question? I can see your hand raised.
Yes, am I on now?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just got an unmute button come up. Karen, look, thank you very much for your presentation. I was particularly intrigued by the psychiatric cases in the appendix to the volume. Now, when he's in the hospital, which is a French hospital in Algiers, he's treating soldiers, he's treating the victims of the soldiers' torture, he's treating refugees, so both from people from both sides of the conflict. And it intrigued me that the hospital or the French were interested enough or humanitarian enough for him to be able to treat people from both sides of the conflict.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it's interesting that he specifically points out that the conflict was damaging to people on all sides. So it wasn't just the colonized who were being damaged by the colonization, and it's actually the violence of the colonization that he's pointing to as being particularly damaging. But also the colonizers, the people on the French side, were also being damaged by the colonization.
Yeah.
The case of the children who had murdered their friend was shocking and horrifying, I think, as well. A very interesting exposition of the cost of colonization of people across the lifespan. Very, very shocking.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. A question from Alice. As you confirmed, Karen, Fanon was himself a native intellectual that seems to despise his own education, spoilt children of colonialism, his quote. Why do you think he didn't attempt to mobilize this potentially powerful group in the revolutionary process?
I find his position as an educated migrant to Algeria really interesting, actually. And the fact that he doesn't have any kind of reflexivity about his own position as someone who is an intellectual, but actually not a native intellectual because he's not African. I think it's quite interesting. I think he was not interested in mobilizing people like himself because I think he thought the native intellectuals were actually a huge problem. And in order for the native intellectuals to stop being a huge problem, they needed to let go of their native intellectualness and their own power grab and actually think about the masses, which they don't want to do because they have been educated in a colonized system. They have adopted colonial values and aspire to take the place of the colonizers, not to actually change the relations of power. But I just find the fact that he didn't have any sort of, no self-critique in there. And I read Black Skin, White Masks a really long time ago, and I didn't reread it in preparation for the seminar. Maybe I should have, because I don't know if he talks about that in there at all. But this is before he went to Algeria when he wrote that, so I suspect not. But he's a very interesting and intriguing kind of a character.
Mm. Yes, I found he's very French. It seems obvious to say it, but in documentaries about him and in the focus of Wretched of the Earth, I hear a Frenchman, and I wonder how important is that? He's a he's black and he's French, but how far is his Frenchness important to understanding him?
So, what's French, right? He's from Martinique.
Yes.
So he's not a Frenchman in a way. He's French, but he's not French. He's French in that Martinique is a colony of France, a department of France, and people from Martinique were considered French. However, when he went to France to fight in the war, he was not treated as a Frenchman. He was treated as a lesser human being, and that affected him. And that was part of the genesis of that first book, Black Skin, White Masks. And sort of, I think he's ambivalent about the Frenchness, and I think him coming from, as a black person coming from a black majority country, has a different relationship to being French than other people. I think he has more in common with the Algerians than he does with the French. However, his book had no traction in Martinique, as far as I can tell. West Indians, most of the West Indies, the British West Indies, all became independent. The French and the Dutch West Indies, not so much.
Yeah.
So they still have a relationship with France and the Dutch West Indies with Netherlands. And it's quite a different kind of situation in those colonies or territories. They call them territories probably now. They do in English.
Yeah.
Than other. Yeah, I think the French, it being French is kind of interesting.
Yes, Elaine asks a question that will maybe build on some of that. She asked, while in the 20th century, 20th century European and particularly French colonization is very recognizable in this book, my question is about its relevance in the 21st century. European colonization is more or less at an end. We are still seeing a new form of colonization in China's Belt and Road policy, particularly in relation to third world countries, especially in Africa and the Pacific. From recent discussions with French Polynesians, for example, who previously had quite a robust nationalist movement, the current preference seems to be to stay with the French in the face of a fear that if they leave, the Chinese will replace them. What do you think about that?
I think China has a very different approach. So China is not a colonial power in kind of the same way that the European colonizers were colonizing. China is about influence. It's about economic relations. It's about getting influence in other ways than actually with violence. So the traditional kind of European colonization was supported by violence. You came in and you violently overthrew the natives, whoever they may be. China's not trying to violently overthrow, but they are trying to gain influence through investment and loans. And it's a different kind of influence. I don't know if it's the same kind of colonial relationship in that they don't come in and try and take over the running of a place, and they're not trying to overthrow the political system, or are they? I guess I think it's a very, very different approach, but it does have bits of colonial elements to it. So I think that's quite interesting. I think that Fanon's work is interesting today because of the fact that there's been very few countries that have been successfully decolonized in the way that he is talking about.
Yeah.
And so what he's arguing for is a complete change in the relations of power. And you can tell he's influenced by Marxism, he's influenced by the power of a union to change things, the masses actually just basically taking over and changing how, using their power of production to change the relations of power. But that hasn't really happened anywhere successfully. I mean, it's just, maybe China would say it's happened successfully there, but I think it hasn't happened successfully there either. What he had this cautionary tale around strongmen taking over and running one-party states backed by armies, and it's one strong man to another. You see it all over the developing world.
Yeah.
And so I'd say it hasn't, what his prescription is, hasn't really worked. But it actually can be quite inspirational in terms of thinking how you might rethink things. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if Indigenous Australians would look at a book like this and think, we need to do things differently. So I think, you know, again, this is part of why it's still, I think it's still a great book. But also, his prescription hasn't been successful, so that's interesting too.
Yes, there's an awful lot in that answer. I'm moved to ask whether it hasn't worked because it can't work. He's attached to a notion of liberation which is idealistic, and it articulates historical grievance, but as a governing philosophy, it's essentially useless. And any variation, it's not simply the attempt at mimicking it, but any adaptation of it has a very poor track record in the continent that he was hoping to liberate. So my question is then: he's the advocate of an ideal which is incapable of realization.
I think that's very possible. And, you know, he wrote the book really quickly, and he didn't actually talk about the governance models that would follow from it. He was very critical of what he thought had been happening in developing countries that were decolonizing. But he didn't really offer an alternate model that sounded plausible. And of course, when he was writing, it wasn't 1900, it was 1960, 1950s, 1960. So we've already seen the Russian Revolution. We've already, you know, so which is sort of a Marxist revolution, which didn't really, I think, result in what he would have been arguing for. Not a colonial state, different kind of relations of power. But also the countries that had been successfully decolonizing had been kind of going down this one-party strongman path. And he was very critical of that, but he did not flesh out a solution, an alternate vision of something that could be actually implemented. And I think for me, that's one of the frustrations of the book, because I would have liked to see a bit more of that. But he also didn't have a template. It didn't exist. And so he was hoping that his call to arms would inspire someone to create something, but it hasn't really happened. I mean, I guess South Africa, maybe, you know, they've transitioned to a democratic society, but they were not a colonial state in the same way that a lot of the other states were. I mean, they became a republic well before.
Yeah.
And apartheid was a racist system, but it wasn't at that point. I mean, I guess we could debate it. Was it a colonial system? It's hard to say.
Yes. One of the errors, and you can tell me what you think, is that he deals with Africa in too simplistic a way. I mean, this is an enormous continent with millions of people, and he's dealing with a country which in Algeria, which is unique in several fundamental ways. But he uses that as a proxy for a struggle that he sees the potential of across Africa. So is he guilty of a reductionism?
Maybe. I think that there are a lot of similarities across the different colonized states, regardless of who they were colonized by. You know, Namibia colonized by the Germans. You know, the African countries colonized by the British and the French. There were commonalities across all of them. I think one of the key differences with Algeria is actually the presence of the Muslims, North Africans, and the sub-Saharan Black Africans. And there were also internalized racialized dynamics between the two of them that made the colonial situation potentially even more complex. That said, you know, I think I don't know that I agree with that, Tim. I actually think that there are more commonalities across the different colonized states than differences.
But there's also more diversity than he's prepared to admit.
There's a lot of diversity. Africa's incredibly diverse. Yes. I think a lot of discussions of Africa actually essentialize all Africans as being similar, when in fact it's the most diverse continent on the planet. It's much larger geographically than people think. Yeah. And the different regions are really quite different from each other, and the people have different cultures and different norms and different understandings in many ways.
So to go back to Elaine's question about China, is it possible to conceive of non-Europeans being colonists? We don't have this vocabulary, but is it possible that the Chinese Communist Party does have notions of civilizational reform? It is interested in changing the nature of governance in Africa. It may be doing it for reasons of carbon extraction and resource expropriation, but we know that's what inspired many European colonial projects. So is colonization discrete to white Europeans, or can we extend that label to the Chinese now?
I don't know if what the Chinese are doing can be thought of as colonization. However, they could be colonizing, and there's no, the race of the colonizer isn't necessarily always white. It's just that around the world, historically, it has been white Europeans that have done the colonizing.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that it's not, race is a social construction. There's no biological validity to racialized categories. So, they're meaningful because we as a society have collectively made them so over history, over time. So, yeah, of course, the Chinese could potentially be colonizers, but generally, the way colonization has been done is actually you go in and you take over forcefully. You don't kind of go in and buy a few things and invest and so I think, it's interesting. So I'm from Jamaica, and when I was living in Jamaica when I was a child, we moved to the U.S. when I was a child. You couldn't drive easily between Montego Bay and Kingston, which are the two main cities in Jamaica. The roads were terrible, really, really bad. Apparently now there's like a freeway that China has paid for. I'm sure it's much nicer now to drive from Kingston to Montego Bay. I don't know what the strings are that are attached to that road, but I'm sure that there are strings attached to that road because you don't go and give money like that benevolently, fully. I don't think. But it's it's a very welcome kind of investment as well, and other people aren't putting in roads in Sudan or wherever. I think it's interesting.
Yes. No, that's a very interesting answer. Our own Ellie has asked, points out that Helen has asked that she's interested to hear why the countries that you've mentioned, Karen, that were inspired by the text, what were these countries, and how has he been used by Africans in the decades since?
It's not just Africans. The book was inspirational to movements in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. Apparently it was the handbook of the Black Panthers in the 1960s, 1970s in the US. And I think that people are inspired to use it because it's a call to arms, and it actually is an empowering text for Black people, or not white people, to basically say, you don't have to be subjugated anymore. You can resist these colonizers and you can kick them out. And so people were in it, people used it to do, I think, what it was really intended to do, which was to be a call to arms rather than a handbook. I think, if the Black Panthers use it as a handbook, I think that's interesting, but also it's kind of problematic because it doesn't really provide a blueprint other than agitate, be violent. He was an advocate of guerrilla tactics, I think, to get change happening. The violence part of the book is the most famous part of this book, which is that first chapter on violence. And the idea that you need to have violence in order to overthrow, in order to decolonize properly, to actually reset things. And I think he also kind of isn't clear what the violence is really needed, what it's like, and how much violence, and who has to perpetrate the violence, and I think that's something that people have latched onto. That he's arguing that you need to have violence, but it's not. Yeah, I think it is a bit underdone. I mean, what did you think of that, Tim?
Well, yes, I'm concerned with any philosophy, the first principle of which is violent resistance. Not because violent resistance isn't justified in some situations, but because there's no natural there's no way of delineating when the violence stops. So violent movements, and I'll say this as a blanket policy and people can come back at me, but most revolutions, violent revolutions, most end up being plagued with violence in their governing structures, and they come undone for those reasons. I mean, it's not unique to Africa. If you looked at the Russian Revolution, which was forged in violence, that violent character is something the system is incapable of actually cleansing itself off. I think I'd apply this to a number of African regimes as well. But he doesn't see the consequences of violence. He sees some of the ennobling psychological reinforcement that can come from the oppressed, violently overthrowing their oppressor. And I get that. My problem is, how do you turn that into a government that deals in liberation and freedom, and that doesn't simply perpetuate violence on different victims once itself becomes powerful? That's my problem with it. It doesn't live with the consequences of the violence that it preaches.
But I think he actually would say that violence is very personally costly, right? So it's, I mean, as a psychiatrist, he was seeing the literal physical impacts of violence on people's bodies. But that in order to move away from the violence of colonization, you needed to have more violence. And so it's a bit contradictory there, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, yes, I do see the contradiction. The other question that comes, I've got a number of questions building up here, but maybe just asking in connection to that, because you allude to it in your presentation. This is, in the modern vocabulary, we'd say it's very gendered. And when I read it before and then read it subsequent to your lecture, that became far more apparent. This seems to be a book which is very male in its call to violence, in the examples it uses. I wonder if you could speak more about the gendered nature of the text.
It's very gendered, and I noticed it a lot more when I read it this time than I did when I'd read it previously. And I think the world has changed a lot since he wrote it, and since I read it, 25 years ago. It's a book for men, by men, about men, where women are non-existent. When they're mentioned, it's just as an aside. I don't think he's talking about using man as implying man and woman. I think he is literally talking about men, as men who are in charge of things, men who are governing, men who are overthrowing, and women aren't actually given any credit or power or agency in it. And I think that's, they're pretty much invisible. So it is very much a book of its time. As a woman, I don't feel it's a call to arms to me.
No.
Because I think it's not. It assumes women don't have a role. And there've been many female revolutionaries, so it's not as though women don't do revolution. And I'm sure there were female revolutionaries in Algeria at the time. But it clearly not a focus.
Yeah. Yes, you'd have to write it in quite a different way now. Of course, all books are subject to the historical moment in which they get written. One of the remarkable things, and you mentioned this in your presentations, it's just the speed at which he writes this book. It sort of pours out of him. And part of the achievement is that this work pours out of him in such a mostly coherent way, certainly rhetorical. As an academic, I'd love to be able to pour out words at that kind of rate and have this kind of impact. What does it do to the nature of the book? The fact that it's not a life work. It's written by a middle 30 he's 34, 35 when he writes
36.
this.
He died when he was 36. So he was 35 or 36 when he was writing it.
I
And he
just
wrote it
wonder,
very quickly.
yeah,
And he dictated it.
yes, yes. And I just wonder whether there might be a whole category of texts that we could isolate on the basis of the speed at which they're written. It's a very interesting notion. 10 fast books. But I wonder how the speed of the writing changes our understanding of the text. Given more time and for reflection and experience, you'd get a different book, but you wouldn't get as powerful a book.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think he's not an academic.
No.
He's just a guy.
Yeah.
A revolutionary kind of a guy, an educated guy, but he's just a guy.
He disdains academics, in fact, disdains intellectuals.
He does in the books, but he also was sort of well, he was an intellectual himself. He was fascinated by literature. He studied philosophy. He took classes with, Merleau-Ponty and people like that. And when he was in France studying at university, so I think, yeah.
There's in terms of intellectuals, Barbara has asked a question that it's about the Sartre introduction, which is whether it's the standard introduction to the different translation. He was certainly on at the beginning of mine. And Barbara agrees with me that this was a terribly overwrought piece of writing, which actually, yes, it detracts from, I'd rather get to Fanon than listen to this French intellectual pontificate on what it is to be oppressed. I wondered, did you have a reaction to the Sartre introduction?
The first time I read the book, I just didn't bother to read it.
Yeah.
So I read it this time, and it is the introduction to my book. Look, I think it's interesting. Fanon knew Sartre, and admired him, and was probably quite pleased that he wrote the introduction. I don't know if he knew he wrote the introduction, but I think he would have been pleased about that. I think the introduction raises some interesting questions about the text and the fact that Fanon was writing it for Black people. He wasn't writing it for white people. He didn't care if white people read it, but that white people should read it, according to Sartre, because it really gives insight into the mind of the colonized, essentially. I saw an interesting transcript of an interview with Fanon's wife, Josie, and Josie basically took the Sartre introduction off the book when Sartre became involved with Zionism, because she felt it was antithetical to all that Fanon believed in, that Zionist turn. And so I think that's why many editions don't have the Sartre introduction, because she's literally refused to have it be there anymore.
Yeah.
Sometime toward maybe the late 1960s. And it's funny because I got my book in the 1990s, but it is an early, I don't know that it's a reprint. It's not a new edition. This is my version.
Yes, that's the one
yeah.
So Barbara says Sartre's writing was overwrought. He tried to up the ante with Fanon in advocating violence. Despite some similarities between the two writers, Sartre seemed to have his own agenda.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think, Sartre's really highlighting the violence part of it, but not so much maybe the rest of it.
And let me ask the question that Barbara asks after the criticism of Sartre. She says she thinks it. So this is her debating position, if I can say that on your behalf, Barbara. I think if something is to be characterized as a great book rather than as an interesting book, it should be able to leave readers with some enduring message or lesson. And I'm not sure I could find that in this one, Karen.
Oh, that's interesting. So what is the enduring lesson of this book? I'd have to think about that one. I think that's a really good question. I think there are a number of enduring lessons from this book. I think the book in many ways is a cautionary tale around decolonization. And it's really, for me, the critique of the Native intellectual that sticks with me. So the critique of the process by which a Native intellectual and the nationalist political parties come to protest against colonization, come to kick the colonizer out, or peacefully ask the colonizer to leave, because in many cases the colonizer left quite peacefully, but then end up being despots. And so for me, the book is a cautionary tale around that. It's trying to be a call to arms, but I think it's actually more of a cautionary tale. And it's interesting. So I'd say, as I said, I'm from Jamaica, and Jamaica became independent in the late 1960s, mid-late 1960s. So pretty much my whole life, I was born into an independent Jamaica. It wasn't independent when I was born. I can't remember the exact year. It became independent right around that time. And my schooling, we had, Jamaican nationalist stuff. Jamaica had national heroes. They were all men. But it wasn't a violent overthrow of the colonizer. It was a smooth transition to independence and a democratic state. And it is a democratic state. It's problematic, but it's not run. I mean, I guess it is a successful, but there was no violence.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm coming from it from kind of a different perspective. Like, why do we need the violence? Because we didn't have violence, and there are issues in Jamaica, but it's not due to the colonization. It's actually due to the conflict between the political parties that Jamaica has, and things that happened in the 1970s that have had long-lasting effects. So I guess for me that the role of the nationalist political parties, the rise of the Native intellectual, the one-party state, the lack of an interest in sharing power is actually a cautionary tale for me, and maybe should be for other people as well if they're interested in going down this path.
That's very interesting. It takes me back to a question I had from the outset. That there's something different about. There's a difference. Let me put this position to you and see what you think. That there is a difference between French imperialism, French colonialism, and British. And the French, because they had a notion that their imperialism was meant to create black Frenchmen, black French people, when they had to leave, they left with huge conflicts. I'm thinking of Algeria, which has known really terrible conflicts in the 1990s. There's an awful civil war. And Vietnam, of course, which we're still living through the legacies of today. Whereas when the British withdrew, there are some exceptions like Rhodesia and like Kenya, but the withdrawal was much smoother. And I'm not advocating this position. I just wanted to see what you think. That with Jamaica, for example, it was the nature of British colonization which actually made what came after more durable, more benign, more peaceful than what the French were able to leave behind? Or is that just terribly anachronistic thinking? Is all imperialism the same thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that that's. I don't know that I don't know that I buy that the French were trying to make black French people any more than I think that the English were trying to make black English people. I would, colonized people from the British colonies have the same rights that colonized people from the French colonies had until mid-20th century. I'd say the colonial relations of power are not that different. The means of decolonization ended up being, and Spanish as well, the means of decolonization differed in different places for different reasons. I don't know that the actual act of colonization was any less violent for the British, for the Portuguese, for the Spanish than it was for the French. I think we shouldn't make too much of French particularity here. I think that just happened to be Fanon's background and his location, but I don't know that it's that meaningful in terms of the kind of active colonialism.
Yes, thank you for that, Karen. Another question. You've touched on this, but perhaps let me ask the question as put from Pamela. How does this work help us understand today's world?
I think if we want to understand most post-colonial countries today, we actually do have to look back to colonization. I think we can only look at Australia for that, to tell us why that's important. So here in Australia, we had dispossession of the indigenous people who were situated as not human, not people, didn't actually become people until the 1960s. Officially, weren't counted in censuses, have no rights, separated out in the Constitution. Still today, very, very disadvantaged. That's due to colonialism. So colonialism has a lot to answer for in terms of the plight of many different peoples around the world. And to use a cliche, to be ignorant of history is to repeat it. And I think if we want to have any kind of redress, then we actually need to think about how we got here and how we might change it. I mean, I guess the other thing about Australia, it's founded on deep racism. One of the first acts of the Australian Parliament when it after Federation was the Immigration Restriction Act, which aimed to make Australia a white country here in the Asian region. So to keep out people from Asia and any other non-white people, and it was employed in a way, what was called the White Australia policy, and it was employed in such a way to maintain the whiteness of Australia. And even when the whole populator perish thing in the post-war period happened, they still wanted people who could at least become white and look white enough to assimilate. So our own history here is deeply implicated by our colonization, our dispossession of the indigenous people, and how we treat people today, I think, is still shaped by that.
Yes, and I'd agree with all of that. But in this, we're moving away from Fanon.
We should move back to Fanon. Yes.
We could get. So and I should just clarify, it was Sue asking the question about whether this is an interesting book rather than a great book, and whether it has a contemporary relevance. So we're getting towards the close of the discussion. I wonder, Karen, whether when this book, do you teach this book? Is it something that you've assigned to students?
I haven't taught this book actually, and I would teach it. I think it'd be quite interesting to teach. I haven't taught it because it hasn't been something that's part of any of the subjects that I've taught substantively. But I would be quite interested in teaching it and having a discussion with students about it. And I guess what would you put with it? I think it's quite interesting to see what students would have to say about it.
Yes.
And looking at it, in light of other kind of neo-Marxist approaches to understanding racism would be quite interesting.
Yes.
He spends a lot of time in there talking about racism.
Yeah.
And
yes,
the dehumanization of the African people. And so how do you colonize people? How do you justify the colonization? Well, you turn the colonized into people who aren't people, which is exactly what happened here. It happened around the world where the colonizers went. They took over. Well, it's okay to take over because those people aren't actually people. And so the dehumanization is a real feature of racism, and it's something that comes through very clearly in the book.
Yes. Forgive me for not knowing this, but where does the title come from? It's a terrific title. And it's one of those titles which is so evocative. It gives you the thesis of the book before you open it. What's the genesis of the title? Do we know that?
I can't remember because it's from something famous, and I can't remember. Maybe I wonder if anybody here can remember or knows. If you know, please put your hand up. Or it's from.
It's from a song called the Internationale. It's the Internationale. I just wasn't cognizant of that line. It's a terrific title. Well, Karen, look, we've had a terrific discussion back and forth on this text, and you've managed to elucidate both some of the arguments you made in the masterclass itself, and open up some very important avenues for debate. And I think we've had an extremely good debate, and that's what any good text and any good teacher like you is supposed to do. So can I, on behalf of all the participants that are watching this live or will watch this as a recorded session, can I, on behalf of everyone, thank you for putting so much time and effort and thought into presenting this book, and for giving life to a book that many of us had not encountered before or knew only as a caricature, and filling out both the biography of this remarkable man and some of the implications and consequences of the text that he wrote. It's been an absolute pleasure to discuss Fanon with you, and thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me. Hopefully next time we'll be face to face.
Well, we all look forward to that. And I know Karen was looking forward very much to her slot in the series in the forum. So we'll be very particular at selecting a text for a subsequent series to enable Karen to actually interact with us face to face. We all look forward to that. It's been a great delight to share part of your evening with you. I'll remind you that next on the reading list is Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, that Professor Peter McPhee will present on next month. Be well, enjoy, if it's possible, what's left of the great lockdown. Please God, it will end soon. And we will be appearing on a screen in front of you, we hope, very soon. Thank you very much and good evening.